Previously on How We Got the Bible, we went through a journey to understand where the writings came from, how they were organized, and what was kept in, what was left out. And that brings us to the exciting part. How does this get turned into something we can actually understand and read? So today we're going to be looking at the English versions of the Bible, up to about 1611. I'll give you guys one of these back here. What are you doing on me? There you go. You're very welcome. So the English version of the Bible. Quite a journey so far to get to this point. You know, we talked a little bit about early translations back several weeks ago. You remember that? What were some of the things that came out of that conversation? For those of you that were either here or watched online and remember or done your own research, what are some important things that happened back in those early translations? Yes, Dan?
They kind of translated it into languages that the people could understand rather than a select few.
Yeah, exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, it was in this language of Greek and Hebrew, right? And also, we didn't really talk about the fact that, you know, literacy was not widespread back in those days either, right? Not the common person necessarily couldn't read. But they understood the language, right? For it to get read to them, they had to understand what was getting read to them. So there's this big effort early on to get these writings into a language that people can understand, right? And so very, very early on, like somewhere around 170 AD, you start to have the translation effect or process start. So this is not anything new, but it was into the languages of that part of the world, the Middle Eastern part of the world. We talked about the Coptic languages down in around Egypt. We talked about it getting out into Latin. Remember that? What was a common theme of that? Besides getting in the language of the people, what else was happening whenever translations took place?
We were trying to find out the true word instead of the different things that other people had put in, change the wording.
Yeah. As there were translations happening, people were putting commentary in there. Good things happened, like chapter and verse. We talked a bit about that. The chapter division started to happen as the translations happened. We try to understand real meaning of these languages that we don't understand, Greek and Hebrew. What was the writer really saying? So yeah, there was an effort to try and get meaning clear. What else?
More accessible for the common man to
Get it accessible. Yeah, that's right. Get it to where more people understand it. We talked about the lectionaries were written out, where these were short translations of chunks of the Bible that could be read in worship, right? So again, it was kind of trying to take the Greek and went to Latin or some other language that was close by and be able to maybe start to put it into the sermon form. It was often met with resistance. Remember we talked about that? That whenever there was a translation effort, especially after the first couple centuries, you got to around the 4th century, started to run into resistance because people get set in their ways. Anybody ever study change management here? Any change management experts?
We had a seminar called Who Moved My Cheese?
Yeah.
That was based on change and dealing with it.
That's right. And we talked a little bit here a couple weeks ago too, that if somebody came in and tried to do something fundamentally different than what we've been used to, well, we would immediately go, whoa, hang on a second, let's examine this. Stop, slow it down, right? First instinct is to slow it down and see what's going on. Well, that's really what was happening, right? I mean, if you had something in a certain language or a certain behavior or a certain practice and you're going to come in and fundamentally change it, I mean, what's more fundamental than changing this? Right? Whoa, this isn't the Bible I've always had. The Bible I always had was in Latin. The Bible was supposed to be in Latin, right? And when you go to change that, you're going to get this big resistance effect. So you see this throughout the history of mankind, this happening. And so even though the intentions were often good, get this thing in a form that people can understand, that sounds like a good thing, right? Have you ever read a translation of the Bible that the intention might have been good, but you went, whoa, you know, it's a little oversimplified. You ever had that happen? I have. I'm not comfortable with it. Now, the problem's here. The problem's in me, right? I'm going to go, I'm not comfortable. It's a little oversimplifying. We talked about the word-for-word concept of translating and the thought-for-thought concept of translating. Word for word, I'm very comfortable with. I get it. Give me the word, right? Thought for thought, yeah, okay. Now we start to get, you can go a long way with that. You ever read a children's Bible? There's an example. It's like, do we oversimplify the thought? I don't know. You know, it's for everybody to in their own heart to kind of figure out. But imagine that on nationwide, people-wide scale. We are doing translating, right? That's really the story of this, especially when you get to the English Bible. Because now we're at a point in time where the Latin Bible has been entrenched for centuries, right? Whole nations, kingships, everything else based around this Bible in this language. And then we come in and we say, we're going to simplify this. We're going to bring it down so the average peasant in England can read this and understand this thing. And so that was met with some pretty interesting pushback. So we're going to look at a little bit of that today. And not get too much into this, but I highly recommend, if you have some free time, do some research online, just Google some of these things. The things are in your outline. I tried to give you some names and some events and some concepts, but we could have a class on each one of these. We could have a class on John Wycliffe, and a class on Tyndale, and a class on the Geneva Bible, and we could do 10 weeks on the King James, right? We're not doing it justice here by just spending a day or two. So I recommend you do some curiosity research on your own and go out and see what you find. It's a very interesting journey. It's very, very interesting. It's a history lesson. If you like history, you'll like taking a deep dive in the English Bible. So there were some very, very early English versions, and we talked also a month or so ago about how the English language kind of changed over the centuries. It changed a lot to where it got to kind of Elizabethan English. Before that, you had this Anglo-Saxon thing, right? I mean, and of course you had the French influence. So the English language underwent quite a journey during the Middle Ages there. But there were some efforts early on, 7th century. Caedmon arranged stories in verse form, right? And in the local, what early English was back in those days. So we see some efforts to do it, maybe telling the stories of the Bible in the language people understand. Aldhelm, around 709 AD, translated the book of Psalms into Anglo-Saxon. It's kind of interesting. Bede, 735, translated the book of John. Think about the effort that would have to go into translating an entire book of the Bible. That's by hand, right? People who didn't speak Greek or Hebrew as their first language, right? Or Latin as their first language. They were Anglo-Saxon speakers who may have studied these different languages, and they've got to translate it. That was a big undertaking, right? So you didn't see like somebody go out and just wipe the entire Bible like Jerome did, right? Where he did Latin Vulgate. That was a government-funded undertaking, right? The Pope said, "Do this, I'll pay for it," right? That was a big undertaking. These guys tried to do like chunks of it for a certain purpose. King Alfred, end of the 9th century, led some reform that resulted in translating the book of Psalms and other portions. So you can see sometimes it took a force from above to get a translation effort started. 10th century, you see another translation of portions of the Old Testament. And when you have the Norman Conquest of 1066, this brought about a major change in the language that was spoken on the Isle of Britain at the time. And it brought about what we call Middle English. And you start to have a really change into that. It started to go in the direction of English that we recognize today, about 1,000 years ago. And William of Shoreham and Richard Raleigh did a lot of work translating the Psalms into English at the time. So, why the Psalms? Why pick that? Your thoughts about that? If you're going to find something new in the Bible to translate, why would you pick Psalms?
A lot of prayers,
Prayers, yeah?
a lot of marching songs in there, traveling songs.
Worship concepts.
Worship concepts.
Yeah.
A lot of
History.
dealing with problems in people's lives, appealing to God. Help me.
Yeah. Right. Real stuff. I'm not sure I'd start with Leviticus. But yeah, pick Psalms. I mean, you guys ever had a little New Testament and Psalms together? There's a reason, right? It kind of has power and meaning. It's helpful for us. It's something that's like, hey, you can get a lot out of that, right? So start with Psalms, perhaps.
Well, and the authors are David. I mean, the authors have prestige and
Gravitas. Yeah. Gravitas. Yeah. Exactly. That's a good thought. Yeah. Who wrote this stuff? That's good. Yeah, Jim?
The New Testament refers to Psalms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. I mean, we refer back to the Psalms as being important, right? So it's a good place to start. It's a good, meaningful thing. So you see the first early English translations were, Psalms, John's great place, right? If you're going to translate a gospel, that's a good one to start with. So you see kind of some meaningful work. Then in John Wycliffe, the 1300s. So we have a few hundred years go by. He stirred up some trouble. Yeah, he wrote in defense of the English Parliament to kind of push back on the papacy a little bit. And this led to some energy for religious reform. So you can kind of see an effort here starts to come out in his time with his leadership to say, hey, let's push back against Rome. Let's push back against the control from outside. And a natural thing that came out of that were some translations of the Latin Vulgate. If you're going to push back against the papacy a little bit, what better way to do it than to get it, having to translate away from their official version into our language. That's kind of a way to say, take that, isn't it? So I think this is kind of interesting. You start to see this first early effort in what we could call a reforming of the church in the English world, especially. A reforming or restoring, a reforming effort starts to begin. And the followers of Wycliffe, who evangelized to the masses, they were called the Lollards. There's another interesting study, if you ever want to go back and kind of, if you're a student of the Reformation or the Restoration at all, highly encourage you to go back and Google some of these terms and see what comes up. It's very, very interesting reading. The Lollards, they were, Lollardism or the Lollard movement was kind of a proto-Protestant Christian religious movement. Came in the middle of the 14th century, went for a couple hundred years, often called the English Reformation. And some interesting things came out of that. I thought you'd be interested. I'd like to share this with you because you start to see the energy to reform and push back against what was coming from outside or what had been the long-established religious authority for centuries. Check out something. The Lollards came up with 12 conclusions. And I'm going to share just a couple of these with you. They're very interesting if you want to kind of understand the state of mind of people. And I think you'll get some of these. The first conclusion asserts that the church had become too involved in temporal power. In other words, secular matters. Right? That the church shouldn't be involved in secular. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Render under God what is God's. So that's an interesting conclusion. One conclusion was that the ceremonies used for the ordination of priests and bishops wasn't scriptural. That's interesting. Start to pick that up. And you start to see a pushback against that and say, what you're doing here in the bishops and priesthood, that's really not in the scriptures. Right? Where'd that come from? 1,000 years later, you're doing this stuff, and we're not finding it in the Bible anymore. You can see how these conclusions drive a force to translate. See, there's a tie in the translation here. Because if you read Latin and you see in the scriptures, hey, I don't see any justification for what you're doing, how do I let other people know about that? If they don't speak Latin, what am I going to do? I'm going to translate this into something that people can read and understand themselves and start to build a movement, right, that pushes back against this. One conclusion is that the practice of clerical celibacy is leading to some bad things. Transubstantiation is idolatrous. Leads to worship of everyday objects. Is there anything necessarily holy about a cracker? Right? I mean, it's you start to understand where'd that come from? Well, we don't see it in the scriptures anywhere. Transubstantiation, right? Maybe we should translate this and talk about it. So you see how these conclusions kind of drive this? Prayers for the dead, right? Pilgrimages, confession. Their ninth conclusion asserts that the practice of confession, the absolution of sins, is blasphemous because only God has the power to forgive sins. So if you believe these conclusions, if you come to these conclusions yourself, what's going to be your next? If you came to an astonishing conclusion one day by reading the Bible yourself, that, wait a minute, what we're doing isn't really scriptural. It's not based in there anywhere. I'm supposed to follow this thing is holy. So holy you won't even translate it. But what we're doing isn't following that. What's going to be your motive? What's going to be your drive?
I'm trying to get other people to see it that way. Explain why you think it's wrong.
Yeah.
Get masses of people.
But if I'm speaking a language that nobody else speaks, I'm not going to accomplish that. Yeah. So you see where there's a real push here and a drive from these people that started these early Reformation movements to get this thing translated. So this really kind of started with Wycliffe in the 1300s and started with a translation from existing Latin versions. And that's very interesting that they're not going back to Greek and Hebrew. They're actually starting with what they had. We talked about that over the last few weeks too, that you kind of start with what you have. You know, if I'm going to make a simplified Bible for non-believers to learn about Christ with, and I believe the translations are too complicated to understand, I'm going to really simplify it. I'm probably going to start with what I have. I'm not going to go all the way back to Greek and start from scratch. And that's what these guys did there. They started with what they had, which were Latin versions. We have Tyndale, this guy, he really stirred up some trouble. Now we're in the 1500s. So he studied at Cambridge and issued the first printed Greek translation. That's interesting, that he wanted to get back to Greek again to kind of restore some original meaning. I think you talked about here, right? What was the meaning of these words? Let's go back. What's the Greek telling us? He had a passion for giving the Bible to the common man, right? He basically, you know, said once that, you know, if God allows it, you know, at some time short from now, I hope that a little boy pushing a plow, you know, knows more about the scriptures than you do. He's saying to someone in authority at the time, right? So he's really wanting to drive this down to the common man level. So he set out to translate the New Testament into English, but he had to leave England. So this is under the reign of Henry VIII. So we often think about this is a very interesting concept right here. We think about Henry VIII, you know, basically started the Church of England, right? He started a separation from Roman Catholicism, right, for England. So we think, oh, why would he be behind this? Yeah, translate the thing in English. Well, he got run out of the country. Tyndale guy got run out of the country under Henry VIII for trying to translate in English, his language. So it might not have been the king necessarily, but it was under his realm, under his reign, right? So the religious leaders at the time didn't like this. You know, the bishops, you know, whoever was running the church there at the time, did not like that they were running out of the country. Had to leave England. He fled to Germany. He became associated with Martin Luther, who was translating the New Testament to German. So you see these two guys start to connect up and say, hey, we have a common passion here. And he completed his translation, and then eventually his printing was in Worms, Germany. That was a friendly Reformation town. Ended up smuggling copies back into England. It was met with enthusiasm, but he got himself into trouble again. He was obviously the folks in Rome didn't like what was going on here at all. You know, translating this into this terrible language that these troublemakers up north are using. And obviously, they really went out of their way to kind of show that this is a bad thing. They purchased copies and burned them in public ceremonies. So there's a big effort here to show that you don't do this, folks. In fact, he ends up getting in pretty bad trouble. Now his work, though, even though he got run out of England, ended up not being violently opposed in England after all. They didn't, you know, the church, the big leaders had a problem with him, ran him out. But he didn't, you know, it wasn't like this thing was burned in public. That was happening under the Catholic era of influence. He ended up being betrayed in 1535 and imprisoned in a castle near Brussels. He was executed in October of 1536, and his last words as he was dying was, "Open the King of England's eyes." You know, he's really trying to rally, you know, support for his cause. I mean, imagine. Think about this. I'm about to limp for a second. We're closing churches because of somebody in Washington said this guy's getting burned at the stake. I think it's very interesting. Think on that. He is responsible for much of our familiar English phrasing. The kingdom in heaven. So these are the words. So these are words. These are phrases we're very familiar with, right? Very familiar with in our English Bibles, and a lot of these carry over even into the NIV, way after the King James. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The salt of the earth. These are Tyndale colloquialisms. This was his phrasing. Still carries through today. Salt of the earth, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow, meek and lowly at heart. eat, drink, and be merry. We think about, just one second, we think about translating, but there's meaning, right? There's words that have meaning in our language. And you can create poetry out of words that have a poetic meaning, right? It's very, very interesting. Only begotten son, there's a term. Those are English words that I in my mind think only begotten son. I think that. It's been in my mind since I can remember going to church. That's a Tyndale phrase. That's a Tyndale translation. He took whatever the Greek word was, right? Was the word translated? Would you take that word and say, oh, it means begotten? Would you say, no, maybe not, right? Maybe it means one and only. I have to go to my interlinear to see. But he took that word begotten, only begotten. And that now is the way we think of it. It's very interesting. Tyndale had a very powerful way of putting things in English that is still stuck today, 500 years later. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering, why was he imprisoned and executed? It was for trying to translate the Bible into English, or was it for other reasons?
That's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. I mean, remember we talked about this a few weeks ago that if I'm the giver of a message in a room, and I'm telling you what God's will is for you, and I'm the only one that has access to God's will, you guys just basically do what I tell you. Who's got the power in the room? Yeah. Right? Now all of a sudden, if somebody comes along and says, "Well, hang on a second, this is what he's reading from," and gives you all a copy of that, yeah, that's pretty much what that's about.
So it was the church that pushed that?
Well, the leaders, yeah, the leaders of the religious body at the time. And if you go back and read about the Reformation, Henry VIII ran into a lot of trouble himself with his own clergy. I mean, there was a big struggle there. Were they going to leave the Roman Catholic Church and create their own church or not? So this is all mixed in with that same struggle. That same struggle is happening, right? So there's a reason why this kind of came to a head under Henry VIII, because that's where Church of England was breaking off. And it wasn't just the king said, let's do it, and all of a sudden I went, okay, I'm not Catholic today, I'm Episcopalian. I mean, these priests and these bishops, these cardinals, they were like, what are you doing? What? I mean, there was a big struggle there.
So they framed it as like blasphemy, or they thought he was,
Yeah,
that's how they sold it?
sure. I mean, remember what the official Bible is in the Catholic Church? The Latin Vulgate. So all of a sudden you're going to say, wait a minute, you're going to make an English Vulgate? you're going to go into English from our elegant language of Latin? Yeah, that's bad. That's causing some serious trouble. Yeah, so we got ran again. Eventually got put to death for it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I find it interesting that it says that they purchased copies and burned them. So they did this kind of above the board, legal way. They bought these copies, and then in the end they just took him and burned him at the stake.
Ceremonially burned the copy.
But that they purchased them. They didn't just go out and take them and gather them up, knock over the stands and take them. They bought them. And then later on they burned them.
Yeah.
It just seems so diametrically opposed to the methods.
They may put somebody to death, but they're not thieves.
Yeah.
I mean, they have standards.
Well, it was Brussels.
Yeah, so
They bought them because people would do anything for money.
that's right. Yeah.
Some people would have hit them, they wouldn't have
Yeah.
let them in, they wouldn't have let them collect them. So they decided to sell them, and people would do it.
They basically went out and gathered them up. Whatever they had to do to gather them up, to ceremonially burn them. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I watched a TV program, Rick Steves, about Martin Luther and the Reformation this last week. One of the interesting things that came out of that was, of course, Martin Luther translated it into German. But it was a driving force behind translating the Bible into the language of the common people that promoted education. That's where schooling really came and started at that point. People wanting to learn to read and to educate people. So translating the Bible had all kinds of effects.
Sure did. I'm not 100% sure of this, but I think Harvard started as a religious
Oh yeah,
institution?
yeah.
Look what it's become. So that was the driving force behind universities. I mean, was a religious education, religious enlightenment, sure. And it had to come through a language that the students could use. This was the empowering turbocharger, right? Was getting into a language. So there was some friction early on, but it ends up picking up steam because then you have some other translations coming on the heels of that. So, big violent event there, right? But it's whenever you do this to something, what happens to it? What happens to the thing you smashed? It spreads, goes everywhere. that's basically what happened here. So now you see, in the 16th century, around 1500s, is right after his death, we start to see others jumping up and saying, wait a minute, hang on a second, this has gone too far. So Coverdale published an English Bible that met with some official pushback. One of the first big translated Bibles in English was the Matthew's Bible, 1537. So, again, you could go out and have a class on any one of these. We could just spend an hour talking about every one of these. So I highly encourage you to go out and read about it. It was a combined edition of both Tyndale and Coverdale. Had an independent revision, the Taverner's Bible. The Great Bible is another revision of the Matthew's Bibles. That was a big one. What Rogers did there in 1537 was a big one because a lot of things were built on that. This was the first authorized English Bible to be read in churches. The Great Bible. That's why they call it the Great Bible. Oh, this one's great. You can read this one, right? Henry VIII supported this one, and he ordered the Bible to go out among the people, and he had a copy of it placed in every church in the land. So you see now it's picking up momentum, and it's obviously it's a revision of Tyndale. People flocked to churches to be able to see it opened up. Imagine that. I mean, it was never provided to them. It was hidden. It was behind. I was at a friend's wedding. I was Catholic in Catholic church. This is 35 years ago. And rehearsal. I walked behind something. I didn't know I was supposed to be back there. Up here, I was in a holy place. I wasn't out back there. I got chewed out. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I thought it was just a building. I didn't realize I was walking. So imagine the Bible is hidden away, locked away, right? So now it's out for people to see, right? Well, there's words I've heard. Oh, I've seen that word written down. Look, it's in there, right? So, but preachers complain that people prefer to hear the Bible than to hear their sermons. But Tyndale's dying prayer was answered, right? The King of England eyes had finally been opened, and the Bible was put out into the countryside. So, the Geneva Bible, another big one. So the big, again, you can study the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims came out of this time period. I've read about this, but I'm pretty sure that the Geneva Bible is one of the main ones that kind of went with the Pilgrims, I believe. Was printed in Geneva after the persecution of Protestants by Queen Mary of England. So, again, a little bit of history here. As I understand it, Henry VIII dies. I think Queen Mary comes along behind. She tries to go back, sort of some pushback or some struggle there. She dies without an heir. That's when Queen Elizabeth then comes in and has to make this choice, and she goes to separate, right? So you've got this time here where it started to be an influx again. Protestants are going to come under persecution by this new queen, so you've got this effort again to translate, kind of, push back against that. Today everything's social media, right? If you're going to challenge, the government, whatever, how are you going to do it today? You go on Facebook. Unless you're banned, right? You're going to go on. You're going to go out there into social media and push back. That's the way you push back. How did you push back then? You published, right? You wrote. So there's a pushing back that's happening again here. So this Geneva Bible was printed in very legible type with commentary and illustrations, and this then ends up becoming the family Bible of its time, right? This becomes the one that really kind of permeate society. And just like the Great Bible became the Bible of the churches, the Geneva Bible became the family Bible. It was the first Bible to print each verse in paragraph form. You ever seen, I think the New American Standard does that. Every verse is kind of like a separate line.
New King James does it too.
The King James kind of started that, or had that too. And the New American Standard, I think, picked up from that. But this is the first one to come out with this, putting verses in there in different paragraphs. So it was all about being readable, clear, legible, you could navigate it. I like that personally. I don't like verses kind of being buried in a big paragraph. The way my brain works. I kind of like the line. It was the first to put words in italics that were not in the original texts. We talked a bit about that before, right? We find some words that... So is this a thought for thought concept coming in, right? This is what you kind of mean. I'm going to throw a preposition in there. Or I'll throw something in there to kind of, clarify the meaning of it. I'll put it in italics so you know that wasn't a real word that was in the original writing, but I'm putting it in here for you to understand it. You're starting to see that here with the Geneva Bible. Yes, sir?
Couldn't they have changed the meaning by ending and starting a sentence in a different place? I mean, isn't there a couple spots that they could have? Because there wasn't really punctuation everywhere, right? I mean, couldn't they have, if they lined it up that made sense to them, couldn't they have shuffled a little bit?
Yeah, so most of these translations were coming from the Latin Vulgate. So they weren't going back to the original Greeks. They were taking the work of the Latin and just translating it over. So you're kind of
You're already stuck with that format.
You're kind of stuck with that format. Yeah, yeah. And Latin's got all the things that we're talking about. So that's the driving force. It'd be like kind of like if I want to take this, this NIV and translate to Spanish or Russian or something, right? I'm just going to kind of use those sentences to make new sentences.
Then my question is I heard that the punctuation was added later, and there could be a couple here that you really got to add another word or two here or there.
Yeah,
Is that's the case?
I think so. I mean, I don't
But
know.
that would be the original.
I don't know the punctuation, but when you're going to try and drive meaning, so what's that thing called? The tetrahedrogram, Yahweh, the 4 letters, you had it, Jim, one day. What's it called?
Tetragram.
Tetragram. The way the Hebrews put the Lord in their language was not the Lord. That's a English translation that primarily came out of the King James. Turning it, when you read the Lord in the Old Testament, that's an English way of expressing Yahweh. So the Hebrews pretty much would put Yahweh in there, in their 4 Hebrew letter format. That's what they would have in the original language. The translators decided, instead of saying Yahweh, what are they really meaning there? What are they saying? They're saying the Lord. That's what they're meaning. So they called it the Lord. So there's a way you took a word, there wasn't no the, and it wasn't the Yahweh. Right? And the way Hebrew is written, again, go to interlinear and read that. It's like, you put words because there might not be a the. I mean, I don't know Hebrew, but I've seen some languages that don't have articles. That's it's kind of a Latin thing, right? The. So if you're going to say, I'm going to turn this Yahweh concept into an entity, we would say the Lord. That's how we would say it. That's how it gets into English. So there's an example of where you might get words added, you might get things changed. And the Geneva was the first one to say, we're going to show you that was added, right? By this italics thing. So it's not only that's what made this so powerful. It's trying to create understanding for the reader in a very simple, basic way. A great question, man. I don't have to answer everything, but here's some examples. Sometime called the Breeches Bible, because in Genesis 3, you'll see there it has a quote: Adam and Eve sewed fig tree leaves together and made themselves breeches. This is pretty early, right? So you're only a few chapters into the Bible when you come across that, and it picks up the nickname then, the Breeches Bible. Went through many revisions, about 140 revisions, and it was the Bible used by Shakespeare. Yep. The Bible of Jamestown here in America, this was the Bible, and the Bible that came over on the Mayflower. So the Geneva Bible was the Bible that was planted here into the very, very early days of our country here.
It's a push right now to reprint it into today.
Is there? Yeah, it's interesting. I'd have to go back and study it and see. I think we find ourselves, again, there was a lot of translation from Latin. So they weren't going back and saying, let's do this big, Greek, Hebrew research, right? There was some of that in there, but again, it was try and get this thing out as quick as you can. There were some Roman Catholic translations that eventually happened, because imagine, you've got this big push coming in English here, and it's going to start to bleed over in the continent, isn't it? So now, these Protestant translations, you've got the Reformation coming out with Luther and all that, so there's going to be a push now to get this thing into other languages. So there were some, funny how the Roman Catholic Church produced an English New Testament in 1582. Finally said, well, why fight it? I might as well go along with this. We'll give you our version. And both were translated from the Latin Vulgate, not the original Hebrew and Greek. And then the last thing we'll talk about today is the King James. I wish we could spend an hour. We'll probably, what we don't get through today, we'll finish up next week. But this had the goal of a Bible that was authorized for public and private use. Because what you had was, you kind of had these two Bibles. You had a big struggle going on in the religious world in England, saying, we've got our Bible, you printed your Bible for our people, but it's not saying exactly what we want ours to say. So there was a big struggle. A lot of arguing over which was the official Bible. The whole King James effort was to get agreement. Let's get some peace and harmony. How are we going to have a church? How are we going to have a people at peace if we can't even agree on what Bible we're supposed to use? Right? It'll be easy to attack us theologically. So let's get aligned. Let's get the church and the people and everybody aligned. So not only have a church that the leadership felt comfortable with, but that was readable to the people, that could be accepted by everybody. It was really to bring peace in the whole English church world. That was the goal. And it did accomplish that. So King James of England conducted the Hampton Court Conference 1604, summoned representatives from all the diverse religious groups around the country to kind of talk about the problem, talk about tolerance, just the fact that he was trying to get some harmony there, I think you got to applaud him for that. So he laid down some main requirements. No commentary. That was one thing Bibles were happening. When people were translating, they were throwing commentary in there. You can see that, right? If somebody goes out and makes a Bible, I'm going to give you my 2 cents in here too. Right? I'm going to give you I'll throw some commentary, draw some pictures. You know, he said, none of that. Let's just translate. That was one thing that came out of this. Just translate it. It wouldn't eliminate any views of one party or another. That was what was causing the problem. Not maybe necessarily the Bible, but the printed commentary that came along with it. So he said none of that. Task was not to make a new translation, but to find something everybody could live with. Okay? The funny thing was, in my opinion, this ends up being a new translation. The work that went into this was like, man, you know, it doesn't look like revision to me. I mean, it's a lot of work, a lot of effort over many years. He set up these different companies, in other words, groups, 6 different companies, and he broke up the Bible and had each one of these companies work on different parts of the Bible. Some in the Old Testament, some in the New Testament, some in the Apocrypha, interesting enough. And each were assigned different books, given different detailed instructions, and work was circulated in the different companies to check each other. And it was turned over to the printers in 1611. And the funny thing, at the title page read, "Appointed to be read in churches." So he's going out with them and saying, "This is it. We're done. We feel good about it. This is officially endorsed." Oh, I didn't flip on the next page. Sorry. Officially endorsed. But it went through a lot of revisions. So they got this thing out, right? It took them 7 years to do this, or 4 years, I guess, to do it. But it went through a lot of immediate revisions. I mean, it's like, if you thought it was going to be like, we're done, it wasn't that. In fact, it went through many revisions. I talked about this early on, that the King James you have today, even the old King James you have today, is not the King James they finished up with. One interesting thing about it, I noticed this. I saw an image of one of the originals, and first page of Hebrews. What do you think it says? Paul. Yeah, it says the Epistle of Paul to the Hebrews. There's an example. They thought they distributed it to Paul. So there's an example of where some things have had some revisions over the years, and became widely accepted. Eventually surpassed the Geneva Bible, and took its place as the supreme English Bible for centuries. The reasons for its supremacy: Greek and Hebrew scholarship, much improved since Tyndale. So they used the Latin and the English version they had as a basis. Again, the goal was not to make a new translation, but to revise. But they had all this access to Hebrew and Greek. And scholarship was high now. So they actually said, let's go back and check a few things. That's what took so long. It wasn't just rewriting English or Latin. It was going back and checking against Greek. Remember we said that the Codex Bezae, we talked about that back a month or so ago, was one of the primary manuscripts that they had at that time. So they actually didn't use it as a translating source, they used it as a checking source. They went back and checked against it. Literary scholarship, very high. I mean, there's no doubt the King James reads like Shakespeare. I mean, it just reads fantastic. You know, I think in whosoever therefore shall go. You know, I think like that. You know, because it just sounds so cool. You know, good impartial English translation. Didn't cause anybody to go crazy. Didn't have any commentary. And it was not the work of one guy. It was a work of 48 choice scholars. So when you put that kind of effort and time into it, you come out with a good product that stands the test of time. And I'm sure there's people in the room here who still read the King James or rely on the King James. And I do. I go back and check against it very, very often. I love it. New American, we'll talk about this next week. The recent translations build off this one. I mean, if it wasn't for the King James, you wouldn't have New American Standard and all the stuff that we really hold true here today. So King James was just an amazing work. I encourage you highly. We could spend a week talking about the King James and the effort that those folks went through in those different. Can you imagine dark rooms under candlelight? Reading these old stuff, writing it, scribbling, debating over a word, and what a great force the King James Bible has been. So I'm so glad those guys did that. Thoughts and comments? Wrap this up. Yes, Jim.
There are people who teach that the King James is the only inspired translation. And yet you point out here that 2 years later they had over 400 additions to it.
Yeah, does that count the New King James too? Is it inspired? Yeah, I love that. It's like, look, we're moving. Look, these words were written a long time ago in a language we don't understand. I want to get them into my language. Can you translate? I mean, I talk to Spanish-speaking friends and Russian-speaking friends. They have phraseology in their language that doesn't translate over straight. Just help me understand what you mean. Tell what you mean. That's the goal. If you have genuine heart to say this is what it means, I'm not going to say any translation's inspired or not. It's an effort to get something in the meaning that the reader can understand.
Look at the word text. When I was a kid, text was text. Today it's a verb, it's an adverb. You text, I texted you.
Yeah.
And so yeah, there has to be some translation or understanding of the word and how it was used and how it's used today. Kids today, text about it. What's the text?
It's just translating meaning for somebody to understand.
I think two words that throws everything out of whack.
What's that?
I think.
I think, yeah.
I think this and I think that. And I'm right.
That's right. That's right. You can think whatever you want to think, man. Here's the Bible. Think all day long. Yeah, that's right. I like that. Well, thank you very much, folks. So next week we're going to get into other translations that build off of that. And we're going to get to probably the one that you're using today. So we're going to continue the translation effort and understand what that process looks like. Thanks, folks. We'll see you.